Today's talk is going to look at the pragmatics of subject honorification, focusing on evidence from Yaeyaman. Now, for the purposes of this talk, subject-oriented honorifics means verb forms that express respect or deference toward the referent of the subject in P, and these are found in Korean and Japanese, as well as in Ryukyuan. Now, I'm going to focus my attention today on data from my own fieldwork on three varieties of the Yaeyaman language, which is a southern Ryukyuan language, those three varieties being Kohama, Maezato, and Hatoma. Now, for reasons of time, I will not be discussing data from Japanese or Korean, but if you are a speaker of one of those languages, I invite you to consult your own intuitions about corresponding sentences in your language as we proceed. And I'm happy to discuss data from those languages in the Q&A. Now, the basic contrast to get us started is shown here with data from Maezato. A couple of notes about the data in today's talk. So first of all examples should be understood as utterances whose speaker is in their late 30s. Second, I'm always going to put the honorific verb form on the right and the non-honorific or plain verb form on the left. And finally, felicity, the felicitous verb form will be shown in blue, and the infelicitous verb form will be shown in red. And hopefully that'll help everyone parse the data visually. Now, with all that said, turn to example 1. Here we have a sentence that means, that elder man went to the ocean. And so we have a subject that refers to a village elder. And felicity requires the honorific verb form here. By contrast, in 2, we have a subject that refers to a child, and the honorific form here is infelicitous. And we can state the basic felicity conditions that capture the contrast between 1 and 2 with the following biconditional. Use the honorific form if and only if the subject referent is socially superior to or senior to the speaker. For our examples, that's just going to boil down to significantly older than the speaker. Now, I'm going to argue in a moment that this condition is the result of two independent pragmatic constraints. One, a constraint militating against under-honorification of one's seniors, and another constraint against over-honoring those who are not one's seniors. These constraints are defined on the basis of a function relativized to the speaker that characterizes the set of entities to whom the speaker is socially obliged to show respect or deference. So for our examples, village elders will be members of this set, while children will not. The constraint star under honor then will penalize any utterance with a subject NP referent from this set which does not have subject honorification, and star over honor will penalize any utterance whose subject NP referent is not in this set, but which nevertheless contains subject honorification. So back to our basic contrast. In 1, star under honor will force the use of the honorific, while star over honor will disallow its use in 2, giving us the contrast that we started with. Now, so far so simple, but there's a puzzle. What happens with plural subjects of mixed social status? Concretely, how will we say something like, that older man and child went to the ocean in this language? Now note that our two constraints make conflicting demands here. Star under honor will want us to use the honorific in such sentences, given that elders should be honored, while star over honor will want us not to use the honorific form, given that children should not be honored. So how is the conflict resolved? Here's the data, and the answer is it depends on the language. So first, looking at Kohama, you can see that the honorific is infelicitous, which respects star over honor, while in Maezato and Hatoma, the opposite is true. So we have the honorific form is required, respecting star under honor. Now, this divergence tells us that both of our two constraints are independent, that they're violable, and finally that they're subject to language or dialect specific ranking. So that in the pattern exemplified by Kohama, you can model that with star over honor outranking star under honor, while in the pattern exemplified by Maezato and Hatoma, the opposite ranking will get you that pattern. Okay. Now, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you that there are additional constraints that target the speaker and the addressee. So first, consider sentences with subjects that refer to the speaker and a third-person elder. So these are plural subjects referring to the speaker and a third-person elder. And let's say we have a sentence that means we, that is, that old man and I, went to the ocean together. What you can see now is that in both Maezato and Hatoma, the use of the honorific is infelicitous, and consultants report that the infelicity here is due to the fact that the sentence would end up honoring the speaker. So this sets up a contrast with our earlier example, which you'll recall had a subject referring to a third-person elder and child, and in, for example, Maezato, that combination triggers the use of the honorific verb form, which we modeled by having star under honor outrank star over honor. But that same ranking makes the wrong prediction for example 8 here, which suggests the need for an additional constraint that militates against self-honorification. So here's that constraint. I'll call it star honor self, and it's going to penalize any utterance with honorification of a subject whose referent includes the speaker. Now, by ranking this constraint above the other two, we can model the contrast between 5 and 8. In example 5, star under honor drives use of the honorific, and star honor self is not active because the subject referent doesn't include the speaker. But in 8, where the subject does include the speaker, that's going to bring star honor self into play, and because it's higher ranked, it's going to bar the use of the honorific that star under honor would otherwise require. Now, having shown how a constraint against self-honorification is involved in the pragmatics of these forms, I'm going to turn to sentences whose subject refers to the speaker and an addressee who is older than the speaker. So concretely, I'm going to consider sentences that mean we, that is you and I, went to the ocean together, where the addressee is a person to whom the use of honorifics is normally required. Now here's what that looks like in our 3 varieties, and as you can see, use of the honorific is infelicitous in Kohama and Maezato, but it is felicitous in Hatoma. Moreover, it seems that while the honorific is felicitous in Hatoma, the non-honorific form is also felicitous. In other words, the honorific is infelicitous in Kohama and Maezato, but is optional in Hatoma. So focusing in on Hatoma, there's a contrast between example 8, where the subject refers to the speaker and a third-person elder, which we saw earlier has the honorific blocked by the star honor self constraint, and example 14, where the subject refers to the speaker and an elder addressee, and in which both the honorific and non-honorific forms are apparently felicitous. So it seems, then, as if the constraint against honoring the speaker is ameliorated when the subject referent includes an honor-worthy addressee, and I will model this with an addressee-specific version of the star under honor constraint. And this constraint is going to penalize an utterance that fails to honor a subject whose referent includes an elder addressee or a higher status or senior addressee. Now, in terms of ranking, the optionality exhibited in 14 means that this addressee-specific star under honor constraint and our star honor self constraint, that is, our constraint militating against self-honorification, are unranked relative to one another in Hatoma. Looking back again at all three varieties, the data so far show that in Kohama and Maezato, the constraint against self-honorification is going to outrank the constraint against under-honoring addressees, while in Hatoma, these two constraints are equally ranked, and thus honorification in this kind of sentence is optional. Okay. Now notice that these examples are syntactically declaratives, and they're being used to make assertions. Consider now the following sentences which have the same subject and predicates, but are hortatives, declared syntactically they're hortatives, and that pragmatically are used to make an invitation. So here's the examples I want us to look at. These sentences mean something like, let's go to the ocean. And I just want to point out that all the examples contain an explicit first-person inclusive plural subject, and they're made in contexts where the addressee is senior to the speaker and is someone about whom the speaker is normally obliged to use honorifics. So what you can see in the data here is that now the honorific form is felicitous in all three varieties, while the non-honorific form is infelicitous. Just a little note, the infelicity of the non-honorific form in Kohama needs confirmation. I believe it's infelicitous, but I would like to double check. All right. What does this tell us? Well, again, I'm going to focus in on the contrast here in Maezato between assertions and invitations with subjects, first-person inclusive subjects that include the speaker and a higher status addressee. It seems like the pragmatics of honorification is interacting in some way with the type of speech act that the sentence is being used to make. Focusing here again on the contrast in Maezato, it looks as if in assertions, like the one in 18a, the star honor self outranks the addressee or specific star under honor, while with an invitation like the one in 18b, the ranking is reversed, and empirically, again, the felicity pattern is reversed. And nothing has changed about the subject or about the predicate. What's changed is the speech act. Now, I'm going to tentatively suggest that to model this interaction, we should posit a more particular version of the constraint against under-honoring addressees, and this more particular version will apply whenever the utterance is itself a negative face-threatening speech act, roughly in the sense of Brown and Levinson. So the idea is this. Invitations are a kind of request, and requests are a kind of negative face-threatening speech act, in that they impose on the addressee's autonomy. This is going to put additional pressure on the speaker to ameliorate that face-threatening speech act by honoring the addressee as a form of negative politeness, which in turn can override the otherwise higher-ranked star honor self. So going back to the contrast in Maezato, we can rank that negative face-threatening speech act-specific constraint against under-honoring addressees over the constraint against self-honorification which in turn outranks the more general constraint against under-honoring addressees. And that will give us the interaction with speech acts that we see holding between examples 18a and 18b. Before finishing, I want to briefly discuss some consequences that the data I've discussed today has for theories of subject honorification. There's two primary approaches to the formal treatment of subject-oriented honorific verb forms in the literature. First, there are agreement-based approaches, and these basically have it that the honorific verb form it reflects syntactic agreement with a plus honorific feature on the subject. Now, if you're going to adopt such an approach, you will need a mechanism for determining which plural subjects are to be marked with plus honorific. And that mechanism will need to be made sensitive to the kind of pragmatic constraints I've talked about today, as well as the kind of cross-linguistic variation that's observed. More directly, semantic approaches have it that the honorific verb morphology itself directly contributes semantic content that in some way honors the subject referent. So those kind of approaches will need to address how the semantics of the honorific will apply to plural individuals, and do so in such a way that feeds the kind of pragmatic patterns that we saw today. Final consequence is I've hoped to have convinced you that a constraint-based approach to the pragmatics of honorification is fruitful. Now, David Oshima, in a recent Lennels paper, also argues for a constraint-based pragmatics of subject-oriented honorifics in Japanese, and he uses a number of constraints that overlap significantly with the ones I've argued for here. What I've shown, though, here is that when we start looking at data with plural subjects, and we look at multiple dialects or multiple languages, we find that languages and dialects end up differing in how conflicts between these constraints are resolved. And that shows us that the kinds of constraints involved in the pragmatics of honorification are violable and potentially in conflict with language-particular constraint rankings resolving those conflicts. Okay, finally, prospects for future research. Korean, Japanese, and Ryukyuan all have these kind of subject-oriented honorific verb forms. I would like to make both a theoretical suggestion and an empirical or methodological suggestion. So first, the theoretical proposal. I would like to say that differences at the level of language or dialect or even individual speakers in the use of these honorific forms can be attributed to one of two factors. First, we have lexical differences, which we can spell out by having different forms determine different sets of appropriately honored reference. That is to say, we'll let the details of that function that characterizes the set of entities to whom the speaker owes honorification be lexically determined. And the second locus of variation will be pragmatic differences, which is what I focused on today and can be spelled out with language-particular rankings of interacting pragmatic constraints. Now, the second proposal is an empirical or methodological one, and it's this. I believe that the pragmatic differences between languages or dialects in the use of these honorific verb forms or other kinds of honorific morphology can be elucidated by looking at configurations where the felicity conditions governing the use of those forms are made to in some way come into conflict. And in today's talk, I generated those kind of conflicts by having plural subjects whose atoms make conflicting demands on the use of honorifics. Okay, I look forward to hearing your questions and providing whatever answers I might have in the Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.